All right, it's time for us to start doing our fairing, and it is nothing but a long and tedious process. Our first job is just getting off the really excess glue that's sticking out all over the place. And then we're going to do sort of a rough dressing down of all the planks just to clean up the surface, and we'll be using a cabinet scraper for that.
As you would expect, we're going to use long boards and sanders quite a bit, but here's a tool you might not expect us to use on a project like this.
A lot of today's work is going to get done with this cabinet scraper, and these are kind of interesting. Some people call them scraper planes. That's not really the right term for them. A scraper plane is really something that's closer to a smoothing plane, except that the blade is usually sitting perpendicular, and then it uses the same kind of configuration as the scrapers that go into this cabinet scraper. Now, we also call these cabinet scrapers, but more accurately we call them card scraper, and they do the same job as these guys, but they're sharpened a little different. Card scrapers have got a 90-degree angle filed onto the edge, and then we roll a little burr over the edge. It comes off at about 2 degrees. We put a little camber into them and we push them across the surface of our material. With the cabinet scraper, we put a 45-degree angle on the end of that blade. And then again, we roll a burr on there, and the burr comes off roughly 90 degrees, give or take, to one face of the cabinet scraper. We then set it down into the scraper body, and you set it on a table, and we drop the blade in, we tighten it up with the blade flush at the bottom. And then we've got this little screw on the back side, and that pushes a camber into the blade. So when you look at the bottom, there's just a little tiny whisker of blade showing in the center, and it tapers off towards the edges. It's a perfect tool for doing this kind of job. You could use a card scraper to do this job too, but I tell you, your thumbs are going to be burning in no time flat, whereas this really does a lot of work for you that makes it easier on your hands. So over here we have our surface that has the freshly pulled sort of staple results, and just lots of crusty little lumpy bits. So we're going to use the heat gun and scraper to get rid of that. And down here all of that sort of stuff has been removed. And so we're going to get down to where the cabinet scraper is just going to do a good job of sort of fairing this out lightly. Most of it's really quite fair, but the odd plank sits just a hair high. It didn't want to lay down quite right. So we've got to bring those into alignment, and the cabinet scraper will do a good job of that. Once we get it scraped down to this sort of finish, then this is where we get into using the long boards. And so those long boards are going to help fair out all that surface, working across all those planks to bring them nice and level. And over here on this side, this has been taken down to approximately 80 grit at this point. This side will get taken down a little further, probably till we've hit about 180 grit, and then we're going to give this a fill coat with epoxy mixed with a little bit of fairing compound to fill in all the little tiny staple holes. You can see there's the odd spot where there's just a little tiny bit of a crack that's still showing, the odd staple holes, little tiny pinholes. So all those are going to get filled with the fairing compound mixed with just clear epoxy. And the fairing compound is sort of a purplish tinge, but when you lay it down on top of sapele, it pretty much disappears once the varnish is on there. So most of it looks really good. It's just a few little tiny cracks. And the reason not to do it early too is because sometimes when you have little pinholes like this, for instance these little staple holes, you put your epoxy on there and it fills, but then as you go through the fairing process, sometimes it cuts through the amount of fill, because you don't ever get that sort of penetrating all the way through. Sometimes it's just sort of lingering near the surface, which is fine. But you go and fair that off, and then suddenly you've got pinholes again, and then you're putting more epoxy on there, and you don't want to have to do that. We want to make that a one-shot deal. And once we do have it on, we don't want to fair it too much. We just want to sand it out just smooth, because we don't want to penetrate all the way through that layer of epoxy we're going to put on there, because then we're going to hit raw wood again, and it's all going to look blotchy.
Our first job is just going to be knocking off all those really heavy globs of epoxy, and I'll try using my heat gun for a while and see if that's productive, but if not, I'm just going to switch to my longboard. I'm using a fairly coarse 40 grit paper on this longboard, and it's important to go in line with the grain of the wood, or else we might get scratches that we don't easily get rid of later on.
Sometimes the stiff board is kind of a good way to go for these two. Of course, it's easier to do that if you got handles on it, like this one.
We'll go over the whole hull like this, knocking off all that excess glue, and then we'll get on to the actual fairing stage.
Now, I had somebody sort of ask about the length of the sole on this, and when you think about it, while we do use longboards a lot of the time because they do a good job of fairing out the whole surface, the longboards we're using are flexible. And if you're to use a long-bodied plane, all it would want to do is flatten out our curvy shape. And we don't want to do that. We're trying to maintain our curvy shape. So we're really, for the most part, using short-bodied tools to do that. Except in the case of the longboard, it's like having many short-bodied tools all connected together in a flexible spline. Alright, I've got this thing sanded to 180 grit at this point. And so this is a good time to give it a wipe down. I still have another, got to go to 220 before I'm done. So at about 180 is a good place to stop. So we'll give it a wipe down. That's going to swell the grain. And then that's going to allow me to, well, as soon as it's dry, we're going to sand it again. We'll hit it with the 180 once more, and then do 220, and then I'm ready to do my epoxy coating on it. So here we go. You can see how much material we pulled off. This is both sides of the boat. Weighs a fair bit. I'm going to have to put that on the scale, see how much it comes out at. Feels like there's a couple pounds in there at least. All in all, I am super pleased with how this has turned out. Very exciting to get done with the planking stage. It won't be long before we're popping this off the mold. Okay, here we go. I don't love these foam rollers because they have a bad habit of laying down bubbles. It's just the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. But we're going to do something about that. I've got a little, one of the tricks of the trade is to take one of these rollers and you split it into thirds or half, and you hot glue a stick to it and you use it like a paintbrush, like a foam paintbrush. soon as I get the side done, I'm going to come back and give it the wipe down with the roller. I just want to get this on while the pot is fresh, mostly because we want to keep it as liquidy as possible, and of course the longer it sits in this paint tray, the faster it wants to cure. The only reason I'm going crossways like this is because I'm finding that it's harder to lay down a really consistent coat of epoxy with the roller. It really likes to go on heavy, you know, at first, and then it doesn't quite smooth out the way paint does in the same way. So I'm just trying to do my best to even it all out. A good rule of thumb, by the way, is whenever you're coating something for the first time, whether it's fiberglass cloth or whether it's just bare wood, generally, if you're doing a second coat, you can count on the batch of epoxy you need for the second coat to be half as big as the first one. I really like this little counter area. It's, you know, it was kind of, in some ways it was simple to do from a planking perspective. In other ways it was actually difficult to do. But, you know, I don't know why it's so satisfying, but it is. And I love that I put this little strip up the center. I think that looks really sharp. Adds just a tiny bit of finesse to the whole project. Now, if working with epoxy is something you're really interested in doing, and you are looking for some sort of really good guidance on the subject, my first recommendation is read whatever instructions come with the product that you want to use. Absolutely, you've got to read that stuff. Epoxy is not the same across the board. It's different formulations, and it's really important you get the word from the people who made the stuff that you're using. Now, I use West System. I really like West System, and I don't have any interest in really playing around with anybody else's per se, although I shouldn't say that because that's kind of short-sighted of me. West System makes fantastic literature for their products, so it's well worth looking at that. And they have a research department that's really good, and that's one of the reasons I like using West System. I know they've tested their products really thoroughly, and they make their results known publicly. But another really good resource is an ebook called Epoxy Basics by Russell Brown. This guy's really got a lot of experience using epoxy under his belt, and his recommendations and suggestions are really quite sound for getting really top-notch results. So I highly recommend you give that a look, and it's super cheap. It's maybe $5 or $10 or something like that for the ebook. Here, you can see how I've got all these little air bubbles, and you can burst those with a torch. That actually works quite well. We're going to just give this a try anyway. So I'm using very light pressure, just enough to skim that surface and pull those air bubbles out.
And you'll notice I'm following the run of the planking. If in the end we end up with a bright work finish that has brush strokes being somewhat revealed, I'm going to have them go following the planking, and I think that's going to look much, much better. Of course, up here at the center line, we work from the center line out. So always looks best if you don't have brush marks crossing demarcation like that. Of course, you should have been careful to vacuum up your whole top of your strong back and stuff so you're not picking up dust by accident as you touch it every now and then, which is inevitable.